so today we're going to pick up in Acts chapter 8. And we're going to be moving on, but I want you to realize that there's no time gap between what happened at the end of chapter 7 and what's happening now in chapter 8. And so just in case you weren't here, I do want to refresh you just really quickly what happened. Stephen got killed. Stephen was stoned to death. He was killed because of the things that he said about Jesus, about saying things like they were finding him guilty, they were already angry, and then he says, I see Jesus right now standing at the right hand of the Father. And that just blew the top right off. They had enough. And has anyone here ever been like really, really angry? Well, I would say try it, but don't try it. Right? Have you ever been and when you get that angry, and you're that just on fire, and you're just so, it doesn't matter if you take out your rage on somebody, like they ended up doing on Stephen, and they killed him. Do you think they killed him and went, oh, whoa, what a relief, I feel better? No, right? When you're that angry, it takes a while for that to simmer out. And so what ends up happening? Just because you did it doesn't mean that things calm down. It was actually only the beginning. The rage mob was just getting started, and the dam of frustration finally broke, and things just poured out. And it says here in chapter 8, verse 1, Saul approved of their killing of him being Stephen. It says, on that day a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem. All except the apostles were scattered through Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church, going from house to house. He dragged off both men and women, and he put them in prison. It doesn't say in this particular passage why he put them in prison, but I think it's fair to assume, based on the context, based on everything else that we've been reading, that one of the reasons that these people were put in prison is they would not denounce Christ. They would not denounce Jesus. They said Jesus is Savior. Jesus is Messiah. And it helps put a lot into perspective for me today as I think about being a Christian in Canada today. I'm sure you've heard it said before, right? You've definitely heard it said before that Christians are being persecuted. That we are, and it's very true in North America, we are the only group that you can openly persecute freely with no repercussions at all. And while this is true, I am sure glad I don't live at this time where this level of violence was completely acceptable. This level of violence that the early church was facing. If you think they simply went to jail and they just locked them up and they made them sit there and wait for the next day, no. The system back then was much worse, right? You were beaten, often starved. This was not a good situation to be put in. And all for what? For saying that Jesus Christ is Lord. They were thrown into prison. Their lives were ruined. People at the church at this time, they faced a real challenge. And they were not enchanted with the idea of, come to Jesus and get a better life. Because remember, these people are still witnessing to others, telling them what they saw, who Jesus is, what Jesus has done for them. And they're not going around saying, and guess what, your life is going to be better. You're going to get that Porsche. You're going to get that house. You're going to get that $1 million. They're not saying that. Prosperity gospel doesn't come until much later when it's trying to pull us off course. Right now, they're just telling people, this is who he is, this is what he did, and this is what he wants to do for the world. He wants to save us all. I mean, quite frankly, it's hard to sell this prosperity image when all of the people around you are being arrested for simply believing that Jesus was the Holy One that they had been waiting for. Right? It's not like they weren't waiting for someone. They all were waiting. All of the Jews were waiting for the Messiah. They just went, hey, he was here, guys. You missed it. You missed it. And I think it's important for us to remember because, frankly, we have been living in a time where it has never been easier to be a Christian. Even if we can be freely persecuted, And by the way, we can. I mean, the fact that over 60 churches were burnt down in Canada in under a year, and none of it gets reported, right? It just shows no one cares. But that's not why we're in it. And I think that's important for us to remember. That's not why we are in this. Because guess what? Despite all of that, it's still never been easier to be a Christian than right now. I mean, let's face it. In most churches, we argue over stupid little things, like whether or not we're going to have coffee cream or coffee whitener for our coffee that we've imported from South America. Think about that for a minute. That's wild. These people are worried whether or not they're going to get found out and arrested and thrown in prison. And I'll never forget some of the stories that I've heard, and I'm sure many of you have heard stories as well too, from pastors and from missionaries that are in restricted access nations, right? And I'll never use names or anything like that because I'm not going to put these people in jeopardy. I think what they're doing is very important. But quite frankly, they are in a place where it is illegal to practice our faith. It is illegal for them to walk up the stairs and come to a church. It is illegal for them to say Jesus is Lord. It is illegal for them to have in their possession a Bible. They tell me stories about about how excited they are to get arrested because it means that they've become such a threat that they must be ordained now. They have stories about trying to hide the true intent of their gathering so that way they won't be found out as Christians and believers. They have to screen their new converts. Churches aren't just open to just anyone to show up. You got to screen them. Make sure they're not government spies trying to find out where the churches are hiding. And yet here in North America, we try to be so open and extend our tent so far to be so welcoming, we end up losing ourselves in the process. It's funny because as we look at these churches that are undergoing such persecution and such trial and tribulation, such as the one in the book of Acts, but also as in the churches in modern day, we look at them and we pity them. We say, they don't have the freedom to sing or worship or pray or to gather. And yet, as I look at them, I see a church that is being tested and a church that is succeeding. I don't know if you know this, but in many of these countries, there are massive church networks, despite the government doing everything they can to suppress the good news. The good news cannot be stopped. That is the church being active and doing what it's meant to do. And this is people, in fact, these churches are the ones that look at us. They look at us and they pity us because we have rows of seats filled with unbelievers in our churches. People who didn't have to sacrifice anything. People who didn't have to give up anything. And they're not even sure if Jesus is God. People who go to church because it's the thing to do or it's the thing that's expected of you. And by the way, this is why I ask so often, why are you here? Why do you come? I'm not trying to shame anyone. I'm not trying to push anyone out. I want you to really examine your own heart and make sure that you understand that Jesus is Lord. I don't want us to be one of those churches that should be pitied. I want us to be a church that is tested and comes out admirable. So what about when church becomes inconvenient or dangerous? Would you come? And what would you choose? Do you choose church or do you choose the more convenient path? Let's imagine for a second that we're not talking about some other group of people. We're talking about us here today. Suddenly we were gathered here together. They dragged me out and they stoned me in the middle of the street. How many of you can say, I will not recant? I'm not trying to point fingers at anyone, just in case people are wondering. I'm not pointing. I just want us to wrestle with this and on our own. I will not recant. I still believe in Jesus. I don't care if that is the penalty. right? You watch as the local government begins imprisoning people, killing people, and the ire of all those people with all this power, it turns on you. Do you stand tall and firm in your faith, or do you buckle under the pressure? I hope I know what each and every one of you would choose, but I don't want to presume. Also, maybe we've never really asked ourselves this question before. I know I ask this question a lot, and I think it's important. The reason I ask you guys a lot is because I'm always asking myself. I want to make sure that my heart is right all the time. It's like my number one worry in life. What is the most important thing in my life? What value, what place does church play in my life? Would I go to prison just for the chance that I might be able to meet with the church once again? Is it that important to me? Is it as important to me as it was to the church in the book of Acts? And as I said, this is my greatest worry for the state of the church in the West. Right now, it is so easy to be a Christian. In fact, for most of us, the greatest level of persecution that we may face for being a Christian is that friends and colleagues might treat us a little bit differently, or I might have to give up a certain pleasure that I had before I was saved. But that's it. That's not a big ask. That's not a big thing. Ultimately, it doesn't cost us all that much. Would you go to prison? Would you go to your death? Would you go against the flow when things get hard? Most importantly, I think, and I certainly know a lot of unbelievers will ask this question, why would God even do this in the first place? Why would he ask his church to go through this? And why is God doing this now? Why is God allowing the church to be scattered? Remember, we just read that. The church was scattered. Everyone except for the apostles. They're being spread out. Why? What could this achieve? Let's look at verse 4. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. Who was scattered? Not the apostles, not the preachers. These are just believers, men and women. And they're preaching. Philip went down to a city in Samaria and proclaimed the message there. Oh yeah, great man Philip. We remember Philip, right? Everyone remember Philip? Yeah, only those of you who cheated and read ahead know who Philip is. When the crowds heard Philip and saw the signs he performed, they paid close attention to what he said. With shrieks, impure spirits came out of many, and many who were paralyzed or lame were healed. So there was great joy in that city. So up until this point, all of them are stuck in this one city, right? All the believers, they're just so overjoyed. They're so excited. They're spending all their time with each other. Things are going really, really well in Jerusalem. But that is where it is limited. It's stuck in one city. And all the new converts that were constantly coming into the faith were ones that had made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem to come either meet the apostles or had come on Jewish reasons and ended up converting along the way. And yet, what was the call of the church? What was the mission that Jesus left before he ascended into heaven? That we are to send the good news into Jerusalem, into Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So right now, they have the Jerusalem part down. They've spread the news. If you haven't converted, it's not because you haven't heard. Jerusalem knows about what's going on. But like any time, whenever we humans, we get into this groove and we have a good thing going, we're enjoying it. We don't want it to stop, and we just want to ride it out. And we don't want change because things are really good right now, and things are great. So we kind of become sedentary. So we needed a catalyst. We needed something that was going to begin, force us to start spreading out and doing what needed to be done. Some may think it's cruel that God wouldn't just take care of our business for us, like God is some sort of trust fund father who just comes along and takes care of all of our needs as long as we're around. That somehow we are owed a life of ease and comfort by the very fact that we exist. I mean, but let's face it, if we weren't complaining about some of the pain and suffering, if we weren't complaining about some of the work that we had to do, if God was doing all of that, but let's say he just provided us food, but we had to cook it, we would find a way to complain. Why does God give us the food and not cook it? I mean, oh my goodness, God, why have you done this to me? We're really good at complaining is what I'm saying. Okay, humans, we're really good at it. We have this entitlement in our head. So whenever people come at me with that and they say, oh, why would a loving God do this? I go, that is a ridiculous argument. If he were, the complaining we have is just utterly endless. But I do want to go back to the question that I kind of raised earlier. Who's Philip? Right? Who's Philip? We've only heard his name once before. He's not an apostle. He's not some great preacher. He wasn't some miracle worker. He was none of that. The only other time we've even heard his name or heard mention of this man was in Acts chapter 6, verse 5. And it was in a list of names of those who had been selected to be deacon. That's it. Right? It was his job, as well as the others that were chosen, to take care of the church. That was his job. That's who he was. He was just a man with strong faith, a man of good moral character, but he was just a man. He didn't have a special role. He wasn't a preacher. He wasn't a miracle worker. And other than that, we don't really know much about Philip. And I want to hammer on this because he is not an apostle. But look at the change that he brought when he went to that city in Samaria. As he went from the temple in Jerusalem and he started heading out and he was scattered and he headed out towards Samaria, he was preaching the gospel. And it made a difference. He didn't need to be an apostle. He didn't need to receive years of training. He just knew what he saw. And he bore witness to the love and the mercy of Jesus Christ. He didn't need to sit there and have the 3 years of counseling that Jesus gave directly to the apostles. He just went, I know what I saw. And if any of you have ever had that argument with someone, you know how powerful that conviction is. I know what I saw. Miracles were happening. And there was a great joy brought to the city, not because one of the 12 apostles, a powerful man of God, showed up and paid them a visit, but because one of the deacons of a church, who was just a man of faith, but he took his faith seriously. And he took it so seriously that he decided, I'm going to spread the good news along the way as I'm headed to wherever I'm going. I think you all kind of understand where I'm going with this. What my ultimate point today is, right? You don't need to be a preacher. You just need to talk. Bear witness. You know what God has done in my life? Do you know what God has done for me? You know what God brought me out of? Because each and every one of us has that story. Not one of us here has had a life without blemish or a life that's had no disaster. Right? We've all gone through something. And there's all of us can probably point to that time where we go, and God lifted me out of that. God brought healing. God did this. God did this. So, are we ready to do this ourselves? Are we ready to be that preacher that goes out and speaks and just bears witness? It doesn't have to be elaborate. Doesn't have to be special. You just tell them what you know. This is what God did for me. Where do our priorities lie? What is the most important thing in our lives? And what do you plan on doing about that? And what about that part of your life? How do you think that projects to others? Because here's the thing, right? A lot of us can say, this is one of the most important things to me, but maybe the world around us doesn't necessarily pick up on that, right? Christians are really good at this too. We're really good at saying that God is super, super important to us. And then every so often you'll hear that person, they go, oh, I didn't know you went to church. If you hear that, that's not a good reaction to be hearing, right? It should be so obvious that you go to church, that they'll be like, oh yeah, John, he goes to church. I know that. If you say God is your priority, that church is your priority, like it was for this group of individuals in Acts, is it evident in your life? And with the others that are in your life, that surround you in your life, your coworkers, your friends, would they agree? Would they say, yeah, by the fruit of their life, by what's going on in their lives, absolutely, I know that this is important to them. Because sometimes we can delude ourselves. And so we need other people in our lives to help keep us in check, kind of like a church. Now, I don't want to be, as I said before, I don't want there to be any confusion. I'm not singling anyone out. I wasn't thinking of anyone in particular as I wrote these things. This is, however, my greatest worry about the church in North America, period, hands down, is I worry we don't take it seriously enough because the cost is just not the same. I don't put my life on the line when I come and stand behind the pulpit. I don't put my life on the line if I put a little Alpha sticker on the back of my car. Right? These things, they don't cost that much. And so unless we're going to take it seriously, there's really no catalyst that forces us to do it. See, the problem is that a lot of times we end up just wandering off the path, and if you've ever been outside as the sun sets and night comes in, one moment you're sitting there and you're chatting with your friends and it seems as bright as any other day outside, and then suddenly you look around and you go, wait a minute, when did it become black? You ever had that moment? That's because it comes gradually and slowly, and it creeps up on you so that suddenly you don't even realize how I got here. And then you realize you're lost and you've wandered off the path. And I don't want that for any of us. I certainly don't want it for myself. I want us all to thrive. So let's stick together and make it a priority and tell the world about the goodness of Jesus Christ. Because when we live this way, when we make these changes in our lives and we endure the hardships that come our way, miracles and blessings are the things that follow. Right? The great joy that was brought to Samaria. You can't do it you can't do it for yourself though. Right? Philip, he didn't go preach in Samaria because he thought it was going to get his name written down in the scriptures so that one day he would be immortalized. He did it because he was excited to share the good news of Christ, to tell others what Jesus had done for him and what Jesus could do for them. This is what we need to do. And we need to do it for God. We need to make it a priority. And we need to do it because we're just that excited that others might know him too.